Well, joining us to discuss what's happening in Brazil's economy is Thomaz Favaro. He's Associate Director with the consultancy Control Risks based in Sao Paulo. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, as we know, President Michel Temer has some ambitious reform plans to really try and turn Brazil's economic fortunes around. But what will it take to get Brazil's momentum going?
Well, I think urgently Brazil requires a sense of economic and political stability that has yet to be consolidated, right? I think you pointed to some positive indicators on the economic front, with Brazil finally showing its way out of the recession, and politically, with growing certainty about Temer's ability to survive and to implement a reform agenda. But again, I think most of the indicators we have seen so far are somewhat weak, and we need to have a better certainty about the country's outlook in order to be more positive about the momentum that Brazil once had. It seems such a long time ago, but it did have, about a decade ago, in terms of a building momentum in the international agenda.
And let's look at that, because Brazil is going through what some people are calling a, quote, lost decade. What are the key economic changes the country went through and the consequences that we've then seen over time?
Yeah, I think the first and most important negative impact that we have seen is unemployment, which has gone up substantially and is currently at 13%. But also, the state has struggled to fund basic public services such as health and education. And if you take public security, for example, budget cuts have severely undermined the state security forces' ability to tackle crime. And as a result, crime rates are going up pretty much in most areas of the country. And as you rightly point out, the key concern here is whether this will translate into a lost decade, because most of these issues and indicators, they cannot be resolved overnight. It will take years, and in some cases, half a decade or potentially more, in order to Brazil to recover from those situations, or reestablish indicators from the such as they were on pre-recession levels.
Now, more recently, we're also nearing the one-year mark since Rousseff's ouster. How has the economy fared in the past 12 months?
Well, it's definitely fared better. As you pointed out, after 2 years of economic recession, Brazil is finally, expecting a positive result. This year, I think inflation is also going down, which is allowing the central bank to slash interest rates and potentially, drive credit up and, revive the economy. But most of the economic indicators are still relatively weak. There's still concerns about, business and consumers' confidence. So it's still shaky ground for many investors as to whether the economy will truly, live up to its potential in the short term.
Now, Brazil is clearly a BRICS nation. So if we're looking at the future of BRICS, let's take a look at some of Michel Temer's comments. He weighed in on some of the criticism about the relevancy of the group. Let's take a listen.
This reinforces the idea that the BRICS is not declining. This time around, you have 5 non-member countries who have been invited to participate. That means a strengthening of the BRICS. People are interested in this organization. The fact that these invited countries are participating reinforces the recognition and praise for the BRICS and for international organizations.
So what's your take on the BRICS and its relevancy in the future?
I think it's clear that the BRICS are not going through its best momentum, but I think the underlying strength of the BRICS doesn't lie on the latest GDP results. We're talking about a major shift in global dynamics, the strengthening of some of the developing nations, the empowering of these nations in the international stage. And I think most of these structural factors that have brought up, the BRICS to prominence in the first place, they remain soundly in place. So I very much agree and concur with the idea that, BRICS is here to stay. And, even though might not be the best momentum for the bloc, the foundations that have where it was built from, still remain very much intact and should be the body per se should still drive, cooperation between developing nations and the strengthening of them, of these countries in the international arena.
Now, one unknown maybe who's going to be leading Brazil next year. We know the Brazilians are heading to the polls for their presidential elections in 2018. And this comes as Operation Car Wash continues to expose alleged corruption by politicians and business leaders. What do you think will be weighing on the minds of voters when it comes to the economy?
Well, I think much has yet to happen between now and the elections on the economic front. Like we've been discussing, we're talking about the early signs of recovery, and it's still a lot of uncertainty about how will that potential be realized or will come to reality, between now and the election. So we may be talking about a very different electorate or very different economic concerns, within 1 year down the line when the economy, when the elections take place. But ultimately, issues around budget cuts and fiscal discipline will be very much on top of voters' mind because, as I mentioned before, a critical aspect of the current economic recession has been its knockdown effect on public services, and Brazilians are feeling the heat, are feeling, the worsening of public services, health, education, security. So ultimately, how will Brazil's regain its capability to fund all those services will be very much in the agenda in 2018.
All right, well, thank you so much for your insights, Thomaz Favaro, Associate Director at Control Risks.